Activity 1A, Classical Islamic Architecture. Activity 1 for this week comes in 3 parts. This presentation, a documentary exploring regional Islamic architectural traditions, and a short question set with a few questions about this presentation and a few questions about the documentary. Before you watch the documentary, please check the question set. Have that ready, perhaps, while watching the documentary to answer the questions. Please note at the top of the question set the specific minute markers to watch from the documentary. Do not watch the whole of the documentary unless you really want to. There are specific segments of the documentary that I would like you to watch. As normally, in the before time, in class, those would be the sections of the documentary we would watch together in class. So for this presentation, we're going to take a look first at some of the basic elements for a mosque, or in Arabic, transliterated masjid, the elements, the structures, and the decoration of mosques. We'll also take a look at some themes of the mosque as a community, as a reflection of paradise, particularly paradise as envisioned as a garden, as well as a structure that maintains, even if modern, elements of older mosque architecture. We will not, however, take a look at the Mosque of the Prophet Muhammad in Medina or a survey of historical forms, as I will leave those two issues for the documentary, which I think the documentary handles quite well. Basic requirements for a mosque. If we look in the Quran and the Hadith, or the writings about what Muhammad said and did, we're going to be kind of out of luck and frustrated, because there's no specific recommendations for what a mosque should look like. In fact, there's a phrase in the Quran that says, all of the world is your masjid. Well, that's helpful, but it doesn't give us much by way of design cues. However, there are some things about communal worship that are mentioned in the Quran and that are mentioned in the Hadith that give us some basic criteria that a mosque, as a purpose-built structure, a structure built for the purpose of worship, should enable. First and foremost is the need in Islam for communal worship facing Mecca. Individual Muslims are expected to pray 5 times a day, and mosques around the world are often available to any individual Muslim to come in and pray in community for any of those 5 prayers of any day of the week. However, on Friday afternoons, the early afternoon prayer is called Jummah, communal prayer. It's basically the Sunday morning for a Christian or the Friday evening, Saturday morning for a Jew. So there needs to be space for Muslims to gather and pray, and their prayers should face Mecca. Beyond that, when we look at the design of mosques anywhere in the world, we have to presume that those mosques reflect some element of Muslim belief, some element or aspect of a community's tradition and traditional identity, and like those churches we saw that had a front facade with 2 doors, one for the men's side, one for the women's side, that similarly mosques will reflect a sense of what a local Muslim community sees as their social order. And as we look at mosques from one place to the next, from one region to the next, from one time period to the next, what we see is a synthesis of Islamic identity and local building traditions, local practices, local material culture, the product of a local culture that has merged with a global Islamic religious practice. So basic requirements for a mosque. Well, one, we know that there needs to be enough space for individuals to stand in prayer. We saw earlier this semester the standard performance of prayer in Islam: standing, bowing, kneeling. Well, that whole process needs a certain amount of space. And in Muslim prayer, individuals in communal prayer will stand roughly shoulder to shoulder and pray in the direction of Mecca. So you need a structure, a musalla, a prayer hall, that provides space for individuals to pray facing Mecca. Mosques have adopted a number of mnemonic or memory tricks or reminders for the elements of prayer. primary element, architectural element, is the mihrab, or the niche in the wall of the musalla, or prayer hall, that faces Mecca. On the left, relatively plain, white, plastered and painted arch, and on the right, the Grand Mosque outside of Cairo, an ornate, columned, and tile work designed mihrab. Both serve the same function, orienting you towards the direction of Mecca. Now, there's another element in these photos that is similar, but in one case on the left, a little humbler compared to the same comparable element in the mosque outside of Cairo. And that is something called the minbar. On the left and on the right, you can see what looks like a series of steps beside the mihrab. That is not something you climb unless you are the imam, the prayer leader, the worship leader, the equivalent of a rabbi or a priest or a reverend. That is, by tradition, the space on which you would preach from. You would have the call to prayer, and you would then offer what's called a khutbah, or a sermon. So consider the minbar, a series of steps beside the mihrab, as the equivalent of the lectern or the pulpit in a church or in a synagogue. We got to think about entering a mosque. At any mosque, a Muslim must enter and be sure that they are ritually pure. Historically, many early mosques relied on courtyards, not only as a communal area, but also as a threshold space between the secular space beyond the confines of the mosque and the sacred space within mosque structure itself. Often these courtyard spaces provided fountains at which a Muslim could take off their shoes and perform wudu, or ritual ablutions, before entering the mosque itself. Most mosques in the world have indoor rooms specially designated for making wudu. They look a bit like bathrooms or shower rooms with tile floors, bench seats, and faucets. However, something I want to note that would not be seen in the United States is something we could see at this mosque in Lahore, Pakistan. This is a 17th century Mughal Empire period mosque with a courtyard in which spaces for making wudu, or ritual ablutions, have been installed within the colonnaded area outside the mosque's worship space. If you notice, these gentlemen over here are sitting, making wudu. And one thing you would never ever see at a mosque in the United States is right here. A woman standing in view of men making their ritual ablutions. In the United States, mosques have separate entrances for women, most often, and also provide separate rooms in which one can make ritual ablutions. Most often, however, the rooms for men are much larger than the rooms for women. We'll talk about this on week 4, activity 2. To beautify these spaces, architects, designers, and Muslim artists have faced a conundrum, a bit of a challenge in Islam for the decorative arts, is that in Islam, like in traditional Judaism, there is a rejection of art that depicts human figures or animals, as it could take away from one's attention to God alone. And so what do you do as a Muslim designer or artist trying to beautify a mosque? Generally, there are 3 forms that you can turn to and use in your design and in your decorative arts within the mosque. These include stylized Arabic script, verses from the Quran, repeating geometric patterns, and vague vegetal designs that you can't really say, oh, that's a tulip, or oh, that's a rose, but it looks vegetal. It looks like it's floral or ivy or some plant-like design. And so to combine, these elements form what we call the arabesque design tradition. So for instance, here is the dome of a mosque in Iran, in Isfahan, and you can see these lozenges in the dome. Each of these lozenges, by the way, is made up of hundreds of small hand-painted and fired decorative tile pieces that come together and form this lozenge. And the scale of this lozenge here at the outer edges of the dome is just ever so bigger in ratio or in scale to this lozenge, which is ever so bigger in scale to the lozenge 3 courses in, which is then ever so bigger to the lozenge 4 courses in, and so on and so forth, all the way to this spiraling decorative piece in the center of the dome. We can see the use of repetitive geometries in 3 dimensions if we go to the Great Mosque of Cordoba. And here, the dry mason stone, kind of a tan and a melon or pinkish stone, locks together in an arch. And that arch is repeated over here, and that arch is repeated over here. And in fact, each archway in the mosque has a pair of arches. It's a dual arched span in the mosque itself, stretching through the mosque and leaving the interior seem like a forest of columns. We can see that again here in this repeated geometry of the wall of a Sufi shrine outside Lahore, Pakistan. But here, amidst all the repeated geometries of diamonds surrounding the center diamond star shape here, we could see this beaten copperwork forming floral or vegetal patterning. And then even in the tile work surrounding that, each tile piece is filled with this Islamically appropriate vegetal patterning. Finally, thinking about the design of a mosque and its meanings. If we look through the Quran and the Hadith for descriptions of paradise, we can see some references to paradise. For instance, in Sahih Bukhari's 4th book, there is a tree in paradise which is so big and huge that if a rider travels in its shade for 100 years, he would not be able to cross it. And again in Bukhari, later in the same book, paradise has 8 gates. One of them is called Ar-Rayyan, through which none will enter but those who observe fasting. And then if we turn to the Quran, there's references to paradise. A lofty paradise, where there's a running spring and thrones raised high. The most direct and extended description of paradise in the Quran comes in Surah 56, where paradise is described as those nearest to Allah in the gardens of delight, who are reclining face to face on thrones woven with gold and precious stones. They will have fruit from which they may choose, and the flesh of fowls they desire. They will be among thornless lote trees, among tal or banana trees with fruit piled one above the other in long extended shade, by constantly flowing water, and fruit in plenty, whose season is not limited, and their supply will not be cut off. Very much the notion that we see of paradise in the Quran and in the Hadith is a notion of an oasis. Paradise is an oasis garden, full of shade and fresh water and fruits and trees that are rare in the desert, away from a wadi or an oasis. And we see that notion of paradise as this delicate, water-filled, shaded place across the Muslim world, not just reflected in mosque architecture, but also reflected in palace architecture. Here at the Alhambra Palace in what was once Muslim Spain, we can see that the palace itself is full of courtyards, here with a dominant water feature, and these ever so delicate, thin columns surrounding the colonnade on one end of this garden area with a dominant central reflecting pool. We see this again elsewhere in the Alhambra. In this case, a geometrically laid out garden with a central fountain mimicking the fountain in the Hebrew Bible that was once supposed to be in the gates of the Temple of Solomon, with the lions of the tribes of Israel holding up the fountain. That's the inspiration for this fountain at the Alhambra. But the water pours out of this fountain and then courses down these channels through the garden, watering the garden. And again, the colonnaded archways surrounding the garden itself are again comprised of these dual pillars, really, really thin pillars upholding the massive facade of the surrounding palace. Even if we go over to the Taj Mahal, we can focus, as often travel photography does, on the building of the Taj itself. But we have to remember that the Taj is surrounded by acres and acres and acres of gardens. And one side of the Taj, the front-facing side of the Taj, away from the less desirable river behind it, is covered by a garden that, if you look at the map of the garden plan, there's that repetitive geometry. There's the water channels flowing from a central fountain, all again repeating that notion of paradise as a watered oasis garden. Now, the rest of this presentation we're going to skip, and I'm going to leave some of the heavy lifting that would have been here for your documentary. As you watch the documentary, please pay attention to how first, the documentary lays out some of the basic Islamic notions of paradise and the way that different Muslim dynasties, Muslim designers, and architects tried to realize that paradise through their monumental architecture. And also, as you watch the documentary, pay attention to the segment of the documentary talking about Muhammad's first mosque, his house, and how his house in Yathrib turned into a community center and the first communal mosque in Islam. And then finally in the documentary, as the documentary moves around the world from Damascus to Cairo to Istanbul and to Jenné in Mali, as well as the Taj Mahal in India, pay attention to the ways that local Muslims, local builders, local designers integrated not only these common elements of Muslim architecture into their buildings, but made those buildings predicated or based on Muslim building traditions stretching back to the Mosque of the Prophet Muhammad. They made those buildings their own local buildings. And the elements of local building traditions and local use of materials that went into realizing the design of the mosque around the world.